Hey, what is up, everybody? Platform Disciple here, and I am going to be bringing you a video covering the most recent patch for Infinity Wars and the balance changes that came with it. But before we jump into that, I wanted to just give a shout out to the Smith of Lies and Cerulean, who have both made some Infinity Wars content recently. They've been posting some gameplay videos. If you like the kind of videos that I make, you will probably like what they're making as well. And it's also cool because they are producing videos that feature decks that I don't play. So you can get to see some very different styles of gameplay, and I think they've done a great job giving commentary over their gameplay. So you can find that up in this corner. As well as there's going to be a video Jason from Lightmare posted on the Lightmare channel, a feature match between himself and JG Snowboarder. Also a very cool thing for you to check out. And while we're at it, I should mention that JG Snowboarder is hosting a tournament this month that I would encourage as many people as are interested to participate in. I will try to put a link to that in the description of the video. I will be participating in it, and it's going to be exciting because of how small our community is, and because there is not a ranked mode. What is considered to be the best decks or best collection of decks is a issue that has been up for debate among everybody. Everybody has very different opinions on that. And I think this will help pull back the veil a little bit, and we'll get to see what decks are effective, or at least what people think is effective. And while we're at it, I should just mention here that I think one of the things that's most interesting about having this small community in a game that is extremely skill testing is that I think what is perceived to be the best deck is going to be very strongly influenced by who the best players are. That I think that a really good player could very well win the tournament with a mediocre deck because of the nature of the game. So it'll be really interesting to see how the tournament plays out, and I'll be sure to cover that in videos when that happens. Okay, and before we jump into this, I wanted to mention that I am recording in a little bit of a different way than usual. Ordinarily, I record and then edit the cards I talk about into the video afterwards, which takes quite a bit of time. And I haven't been able to record this video on the patch as quickly as I'd like to. So in the interest of getting the video out to you faster, I am opting to do this where I've got the game open in the background, and I'm just going to be manually pulling in the cards. So it's going to look a little different. It's not going to look as professional, but you're getting the video in a timely fashion. So I think it is worth it. Okay, so let's start by just going over, there are notably a couple changes that are not related to balance or the cards. There is notably in-game, the player who has priority is now, in addition to being indicated by the little yellow dot next to the player's username, the battlefield also reflects a day and night cycle. The player with priority has a lit up battlefield, and the player who is not got priority has a nighttime battlefield. I really like that. It's a very clever way to portray that priority being passed. I think that could be even further solidified by maybe instead of having that little yellow dot next to players' usernames, it could be a sun, and the player who is not got priority could have a moon symbol next to their username. I think that could really tie things together. It might also be cool to, when a player gains priority, to have a sound indicator, like birds chirping, like a sunrise kind of, morning sound effect. Overall, very happy about that. There's also been some other quality of life changes, like, for example, you can now choose the cover of your deck in the deck builder, which is really nice. I think that's fun, and it helps people organize their decks a little more cleanly. But let's jump into what we're really here for, which is the balance changes. We're going to go through them one by one, and I'm going to talk about my thoughts on those. So let's just pull that up real quick. There we go. Okay, so now you can see kind of what we're dealing with here, but this is going to make it a lot easier for me because I don't have to edit the video. So we're starting with Agent Kale. The change here is that the card used to check if a character you controlled that was deployed cost 7 or more. Now it checks if a character you control on the battlefield has 15 or more attack. So the battlefield versus deployed distinction is pretty significant. I'm not sure which is easier to get, 15 attack or 7 cost. Might be 15 attack, actually. But the big reason for this change is that we have a few cards that care about 15 attack, and this helps solidify that as a theme, that players who are maybe less comfortable with deck building, this will help indicate to them that you can combine these collections of cards to make a cohesive strategy. So like Made Mighty by Metal. This is one of these other kind of signpost cards that tells you putting these 15 attack characters in one deck has some merit to it. So I think that's really great from a perspective of helping new players get comfortable with deck building. And I don't think it really dramatically changes how powerful Agent Kale is. So very good change overall. Okay, next. Next we have Devil of Despair. And Devil of Despair has been buffed. It has 2 more health now, and it can now activate its discard effect from the command zone. Frankly, I thought the card was just fine before as a 6/6 that couldn't be activated from the command zone, but these buffs will allow Devil of Despair to be a more legitimate commander for Exiles because it can now be an enabler for those discard themes. So I think this is a pretty good change. I don't feel very strongly about it. The one thing I feel like highlighting here is that Devil of Despair has received a lot of changes relative to other cards, which is a little surprising to me. However, I have never felt on this path of those changes that any of them have been really off base. So this is consistent with what I think is appropriate for the card. Okay, next. Champion's Companion. Okay, and this card received a significant rework, and I believe actually this may be closer to the original version of the card, that it's changed a few times over the years. That the most recent previous version of the card was a 6-cost 10/10 that while Champion's Companion was deployed, Angels in your hand would have Vigilance. And frankly, that card was really bad. It just wasn't very good. So seeing that card get changed, and in this case to a better, more interesting card, is positive. However, I am unsure how nice this card is going to play with other cards in the game. I think it's at a minimum good. And in a worst case scenario, it might be a little too good or too annoying. But we'll have to wait and see. But basically my thoughts here is that, so the card says when it's deployed, unique characters in your hand that cost 5 or less have haste. And notably, that's going to let you cheat some characters onto the battlefield in a way that is surprising and difficult to interact with. The big culprit here is Gabrielle, the Torch in the Dark. And Gabrielle is a very annoying card to play against, and very frequently, if it comes out onto the battlefield early, it can be frustrating and can take over the game. I don't think Champion's Companion is going to be a make or break here, but it is worth keeping an eye on this, just because this card specifically is very dangerous. It's also worth noting that Champion's Companion, because its haste enabling effect happens when Champion's Companion is deployed, you can play Champion's Companion and a unique character with haste in the same turn, which will result in situations where the opponent has no visibility to either card. So there is no easy way to plan around your opponent suddenly having a Tulio in the assault zone. And we're going to bring up Tulio real quick. That there's no indicator. If the opponent has 6 resources, they could just dump Tulio and you won't know when it's going to happen. Okay, so that's my thoughts on that card. I think just give it some air, let it breathe, see how it plays out. But it is a card that could merit paying attention to. Okay, next we have She Who Wanders Far. And this card, the previous version of it, would reduce the first attacking enemy in the assault zone. Its attack would be reduced to 0 permanently, which was very powerful. And also, I think for a lot of people, including myself, was unexpected the first time it happened. It's a little startling that effect is permanent. And now the new version of the card behaves a little bit more as I expected it to behave on first read through. It is definitely a nerf, but it makes it so She will make it so the first enemy character in the assault zone does not attack. So definitely a nerf. I don't think the previous version of She was too strong, but I do think that this version is more clear, and I really am always in favor of having cards be clear in how they function. So I feel pretty reasonably good about this change. I don't think this is too much of a problem. I think the card's still pretty good. Okay, next, Covert Battlesuit, and this is a weird one. So Covert Battlesuit in the previous patch had been changed to experiment with the barrier keyword. The previous version of the card would gain barrier when deployed, and as long as it had barrier, it also had untouchable. This version is actually a revert, which is that it has untouchable and indestructible until it leaves combat with a character for the first time. This new version, which is, I guess, actually the old version, is much more interesting. That being said, I don't think either version of the card was particularly good. I have yet to see these cards in a game ever. So I don't really care that much, because right now this is not a card to me, that it doesn't really have a place in the game. Maybe we will see it in draft. And that will be cool. I think this could definitely be really strong in draft because it's basically guaranteed to trade with at least one thing, but we don't have draft yet. So for the time being, it's a really clunky, big 6-drop. So, not really, I don't really feel too strong about it either way. Okay. I'll give it the benefit of the doubt and say it's a good change. Okay, next we have Canopy Defender. And this card got a straight up buff. The card was a 5/10. Now it is a 5/12. And the previous version of the card was unplayable garbage. And the new version of the card is unplayable garbage, which I think is actually good. That's a good balance change when you can buff a card and really not feel like you've disrupted anything. This will just make the card feel a lot better in draft when draft comes out. But you're really not going to see anybody play this in their deck either way. But I will say that having that +2 health is really big, because a lot of 4-cost characters have 10 attack, and this 2 health buff will allow it to block a 10 attack character that is going to come down to the battlefield around the same turn, turn 4, and can defend against that character plus one other character. So, pretty good, but the card is not one you will see until draft comes out, is my expectation. Okay. Next we have Bad Bot. And I've got the alt art here. We're going to change that to a more familiar Bad Bot for y'all. Bad Bot has had its cost reduced by 1, which I think is fine. That the card at 4 cost versus 3 cost, I don't think really changes the game very much. It is mentioned, though, that in draft or rift run, having that 1 cost reduction might make the card feel a little bit better, but frankly, Bad Bot is a card that literally cannot function without other cards to support it. I feel fine about this change. It is objectively a buff, but it is a buff to types of decks that currently aren't really popular. So, and even when those decks get played, I don't think Bad Bot is necessarily like an auto include. So it's cool to see Bad Bot getting some love. All right. Next, Cloaked Operative. Okay. And this card historically has not really ever been played. I've literally never seen it. Ever. The previous version of the card did not have Barrier 1. That's the change here. Now it has Barrier 1 in addition to the rest of it. But the real fundamental problem for the card has been that it 7/7 is basically a 2 cost units worth of stats, and it did not have a 3 cost worth of effect to make up for that. I think the barrier and haste really helps. Shield is not always relevant in a lot of games. I think this is going to be quite a bit better. I don't think it's going to be good enough to see it in normal constructed gameplay, but I do think it makes it a lot more palatable to pick in draft, where this card could potentially block once with the barrier before dying. And by having barrier and haste, it makes the card absorb buffs really well. So, good change, but I still think the card is quite weak, if I'm being honest. But maybe it's just makes it a little more palatable for draft. Okay. Next, Orion. Not that one. The other one. Okay. Orion, Master Architect. And the previous version of Orion was the same as this. However, this version lets you play the artificial character from your graveyard with haste, which I think is a very warranted and desired change, because the previous version of the card, you would have to take 1 turn to use Orion's ability, take another turn to play the character from the graveyard, and then in the 3rd turn you could finally attack with that character. And the character that he produces is not even really cost efficient most of the time, because it's an XX where X is twice its cost. So if you target a 3 cost character in your graveyard, you get a 6/6, which is you're paying more than you want to. So this is definitely a buff. I think the card is still not good, but again, making these cards that are bad a little better, and they're still bad, is always a good change. And it will make it, again, maybe a little more fun for draft. Okay. Next, Shrapnel Launcher. Another card that has historically been very bad and has never really seen play. The previous version of this card did not have reach, and you could only sacrifice artificial characters. This you can sacrifice artificial characters or artifacts. Again, I think this card is still very bad. But again, I'm saying it again, if you take a card that's bad, buff it, and it's still bad, that can really only be good for the game, in my opinion. And it's going to make the card feel a little better in draft, and I think that Reach is especially nice because one of the problems with draft, or I shouldn't say problems, one of the things that can happen in draft is if a player has a very potent early game flyer, because it's not a constructed format, people have less consistent decks and may have very few ways to respond to a early game flyer, and that early game flyer could do upwards of 50 damage, even if it's not a very strong character. So just having a couple more options with Reach without really disrupting the rest of the game is great. So big fan of this change. Like, when I say these cards are bad and they're still bad, that doesn't mean I dislike the change. It actually usually means I like the change. The changes that scare me more are when a card gets buffed that was already good or something like that. And that's not what's going on here. And speaking of cards that got buffed that were already good, maybe some people disagreed with me on this because I was playing the card. Maybe other people were not playing the card. But Pyre Quartermaster, previous version of the card was a 6/4, so stat line has just been straight up buffed. And the previous version of the card would pull a Pyre out of your deck. So you had to, if you wanted to take full advantage of this card, include Pyre Fortress of Flamedawn in your deck. The new version just creates one and puts it in your hand. The new version of the card is got a better stat line and is just better. That being said, I think maybe when I said the card was good before, I think it was maybe it was just fine. Maybe it was never powerful, but I was playing with it and didn't feel bad about it. The new version is objectively better. And notably, one of the significant things about this is that in draft, it was really, really unlikely that you would get both Pyre and the Fortress, the Quartermaster and the Fortress. So now you don't have to have both. But it's weird to me that they buffed this finding the Fortress and the stat line. I would have preferred if they had left the stat line as is. It's probably fine. I don't think it's going to affect how it plays in constructed gameplay very much, but I think that this card is going to be a top pick when draft comes out. I think this is a really good card for draft. Oopsies. Okay. What do we got now? Mega Unit. Another card that historically has not been very good. Mega Unit 3 specifically. So Mega Unit 3, the previous version of the card had, you could sacrifice an artificial character to give it unstoppable, and the first time it enters combat this turn, it gains indestructible. The new version of the card leverages that barrier keyword, which is way more clear. It uses a lot less text space, which is really nice. It's also a pretty significant buff because the barrier, I believe that it gains may be permanent. At least that's how the card is written. Whereas the previous version of the card, that indestructible was a until end of turn effect. So this is a pretty big buff. I don't think it's enough to make the card playable in constructed, but it is much better now. I will admittedly say here that I hope that this works the way that it is written, because when there have been some other barrier changes, they have not worked as written. And I will see if I can find that. I'm trying to remember the name of the card. I'm not sure if it's been fixed yet. So this will be a shout out to any developers watching the video. Okay, yeah, Shield Generator. So this card also gives a barrier 1. But the way barrier works is it should protect you from kill effects. The Shield Generator for a really long time, and it might still be the case, when you gave a character barrier, it would not protect from kill effects. It would only protect from combat. And the reason is that I believe that the actual function of the card was the same, which is that the first time a character enters combat, it gains indestructible. So it didn't give the character indestructible until combat. So a card like Death Ray would happen before combat. So anyways, this is just a reminder to double check that that works the way that it's supposed to, in case that hasn't already been done. Okay, next, Hell's Gambler, and this one merits quite a bit of discussion. At least I think so. The previous version of this card cost 2 less. And I will, before we jump into it, just say the previous version of the card cost 2 less, and the effect on the card was slightly better than this. So this has been nerfed by 2, which is usually enough to take a card from being good to unplayable. And its effect has been nerfed. And the stat line's the same. So I want you to let that sink in for a sec. Because I think almost any card in the game, if you add 2 to the cost, makes the card unplayable. Like if we take a look at any other 6-drop in the game, you add 2 to the cost, probably unplayable. And the effect got nerfed. So the difference now is that now, instead of reducing the cost of a random card by 7 permanently, it reduces the cost by 7, but you discard the card at the end of the next turn. So you have to play it right away. And this card costs 2 more. This card is a dead card now. It is unplayable. And I think that the previous version of the card was not good. So this was a card that I think was not a good card that is now like irreparably bad. Like it's you won't even play this in draft. So why make this change? Great question. Really great question. So I think that really the card was only quite good in playing it in meme decks, where you would try to like hit Virus of Avarak and make that card a card that you could cast for 7. And you would do that by having Hell's Gambler and then using discard effects from Exiles to make it so that the only card in your hand was the Virus of Avarak or some other really big card like Corrupted Celestial Dragon, right? And that deck was fun, and it was not good. Maybe there was another deck that was using Hell's Gambler, but I haven't seen this card used anywhere that seemed remotely competitive. And now the card is really bad. I think that my thoughts are that maybe there was some concern with the random nature of the effect, being very frustrated for some players that it could potentially decide the outcome of the game off of like a die roll, which I understand is being frustrating, but provided that it's not competitive, I don't think it's as big of a deal, and I don't think it's ever been competitive. Basically, I'll leave it at that. I would prefer that this card get reworked completely, that if the effect is so problematic that the card has to be nerfed to the point where it's unplayable, you may as well just take the artwork on the card and use it on something that has an impact in the game. Because right now, this version of the card is not even palatable to play as a casual card. And that's not a great place to be. Like if it's not draft, competitive, or casual, then it's not a card. It's you're wasting this art asset. That's my opinion. We can talk more about Hell's Gambler in the future. There was some pretty good conversations about it on the Discord, but that's my 2 cents without getting too far into the weeds. Okay, next, Nero. Okay, so Nero has been changed so that she sacrifices a character instead of destroying one of your characters. First, I wanted to say that mechanically this changes how it interacts with a few cards. So, like Candid's Thrall. This card says when it's sacrificed, you draw a card. So now that has a synergy with Nero. So this is a cool change because it lets Nero synergize with some of Veror's existing cards that it previously did not. However, I'm going to share, again, my 2 cents. I don't think it's controversial for me to say this, but the distinction between kill and sacrifice is a distinction made by the game Magic the Gathering. And that distinction is confusing and unnecessary most of the time. I think the effect of sacrifice should be removed from the game entirely. That would require reworking a lot of cards, like a lot of cards. So maybe that's not something that needs to be done as a priority, but I think any instance of sacrifice should be changed to kill. Yep, that's basically my 2 cents. That distinction, again, comes from Magic the Gathering, and in Magic the Gathering, they can't change it because their game is a paper game that has like 15-ish, I don't know how many, maybe more than 15. Yeah, it's more than 15. Maybe it's like 20 or 25 years of history at this point. Yeah, actually, I think the game came out in like 93, so it's even longer. But that game has such a long history that they can't change that mechanic, even though it should be changed. Because it doesn't benefit anyone. It only serves to confuse players. It doesn't mechanically benefit the game. Okay. So the Nero change is actually kind of cool, but I do think that Infinity Wars has an opportunity to not make the mistake that Magic the Gathering has there. And maybe we'll talk about that more in the future. Okay, next. Believer of Paragons. And Believer of Paragons, the previous version of the card, her ability to give indestructible to unique characters would happen even if Believer of Paragons was in the support zone. And I don't think that the card was necessarily too strong, but it was really frustrating to play against sometimes because your opponent would have an indestructible unique character that you can't really interact with meaningfully because it's indestructible by nature. And they would also have Believer of Paragons, which you couldn't ordinarily interact with because it was in the support zone. And that made it feel like your options to play against the card were extremely limited. This is a nerf for sure. However, it is a nerf that makes the card feel more palatable to play against, that it feels like you can interact with the card more meaningfully. And I'm a big fan of that. So I like this nerf. If the card needs to be buffed elsewhere, like maybe increase the stats a little, that is fine. But for the time being, I think that giving players a window to interact with the card is good. Okay, and we have our final card here, Taiga. This card has a long history. And you can see here that I have an infinity bordered version of Taiga. Infinity bordered cards, for those of you who don't know, because you may have not seen that many of them, or if you have not been around in the game for a long time, used to be rewarded to players for exceptional performance in ranked gameplay, or tournaments, or Rift Run, or which is draft. That the best players, like really the cream of the crop, that's me, would get some of these cards as reward. And I picked this card because at the time, this card was not just competitive, it was unfair and broken. And it received multiple nerfs over the years. And the previous version of the card was if an artificial character you controlled would die in the same zone as Taiga, all other characters you control in that zone would get +1/+1. That version was frankly not very good. The really old version of the card was Taiga did not care what zone the characters died in. And that card was so broken. So I'm glad that that's not making a return, but it's nice to see that there's some middle ground here, that this version of the card will buff Taiga, which will help her get outside of Lightning Blast range, and Lightning Blast is significant here because it is that 4 damage, that magical 4 damage, and there's a lot of cards that do 4 damage in the game. Lightning Blast is just one of them. So I'm happy to see Taiga get a small buff, because I have history with the card, and I think that the Robots aggro / mid-range deck was a really cool deck in Infinity War's history, but it's been a lot less popular recently, is what I've found, and seeing a card that might help push that theme a little bit back into the spotlight, I think is okay, but Taiga is definitely a card that deserves to be watched closely because her history of being extremely broken. I don't think this version's broken, but the old version was crazy. And that wraps it up. It was quite a long video, but there was a lot of balance changes and I think a lot to talk about. I'm really looking forward to seeing how these play out. I'm excited to hear other people's opinions, and I've already been kind of listening to them on the Discord. So until next time, everybody, take it easy.